this session is based around a set of resources that I was involved in developing with the Early Intervention Foundation and with funding from the Nuffield Foundation. It's called the Early Years Library, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. But the idea is that we are all familiar with a whole range of skills that we'd like to support young children to develop. And there's also a lot of information out there from the research on the most effective techniques for developing those skills. So what we tried to do was pull that all together and say, if, for example, you want to support children's emotion regulation, what are the techniques? What has research told us are the most impactful things that adults can do in a setting with the children to support that? So we will come on to the Early Years Library in a little bit. I guess I'll just introduce my center as well by way of background. I work at the Center for Research on Play in Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge. And we do a lot of work. Feel free to look us up on the web. We're often looking for staff in early years settings. We work with health visitors. We work with all kinds of different professionals in different sectors to not only understand the research, but also to understand what that would look like in practice. So it's very important to us that we have those relationships, and do feel free to get in touch. The topic today, I mean, I don't need to tell this group because we're nearly at 300 people now, but I do like a bit of data. I am a scientist, so I thought I would start with some results from a survey that was done in June 2020. So this was right after that first a big wave of COVID and the first lockdowns that happened in England. And there was a survey of parents of young children at the time, and they were asked about the different areas of children's development where they were seeing the most impact on their children in terms of those different experiences, the children having to stay home, the children not getting to interact with a wide range of people outside of their home, and so on. And what parents said overwhelmingly was that it was children's social and emotional development that they were seeing the most impact on. And of course, their physical development and their language skills and other things were also being impacted, but the biggest area that parents reported was social and emotional development. I'd be really interested to know now, a couple of years on, well, 3 years on from that, gosh, whether that is still the main priority above these other areas. But nevertheless, I think we all agree that it is certainly a really important area, even in normal times. So I'm not surprised that there are almost 300 people here today to hear about emotion regulation. So what is it? Emotion regulation, for those of you who are working with the Early Years Foundation stage, this is part of personal, social, and emotional development. For those of you joining us from other parts of the world, you may have different frameworks that you're using in your respective contexts. But the idea of emotion regulation is universal. It matters for all children, and it's part of a bigger idea, which is self-regulation. And it involves the idea that you, to some extent, you can stop or start or choose a different path to what you're doing. And that goes for your emotions as well as your actions and your thoughts. So emotion regulation specifically is about your ability as a person to be able to control your emotional reactions. That's the kind of short version. What I want to do for the next few minutes is go into that a little bit more and give you a sense from the point of view of brain development, what is really going on when we talk about emotion regulation. And I'm going to show you a brain, and the model that I'm going to show you when we talk about what's going on in the brain is actually, it's true for adults as well as for children. So it's not that children have a totally different brain or they're a different species altogether, right? They are also humans, and there's a continuity between what's going on with young children and what's going on with adults. It's just that for children, not everything is all kind of connected and wired up yet, right? So some of you may already completely buy into the idea that self-regulation is an important thing for lifelong learning and happiness and so on. But for those of you who haven't seen the data on this, let me just show you. This is data from a life course study in New Zealand, and what they showed, I won't go into all the ins and outs, but if you can see on your screen, we have 4 charts here. And what each of those charts is showing along the bottom is children's self-control. So self-control from low to high each time, same thing, self-control low to high, self-control low to high, and so on. And then each chart is showing you the relationship between their self-control and all kinds of things. This one is health, this one is wealth, this one, I'm turning my head so I can read them all. You know, all these other factors, criminal convictions, all kinds of other things. So actually self-regulation really is the foundation to all sorts of areas of development and future life. And in every case, what they showed was the self-regulation that children are developing, even in those early years, it's related to things like their health outcomes. It's related to things like how happy they are in their jobs later on, and so on. So if you're interested, there's the name of the study. You can go and look up all of the details and study the charts more if you want to. But it's just a really strong example of looking across a whole lifetime with a huge group of people. We can see those patterns. So self-regulation is something that we really want to try and support in those early years in order to give people the best chances in all areas. It's not just about what grades you're going to get. It's all kinds of things actually that follow from that. So I said I would show you a brain. Here is the picture of the brain that I am going to use to explain what's going on when we talk about emotion regulation. The key idea here is going to be bottom up and top down, so that there's a two-way process. And on the one hand, in your brain, actually, first, let me just, for those of you who may not be that familiar with looking at a brain, if I were in person, I would turn this way. I don't know if it's going to be the right direction, and sometimes screens flip things around, but imagine if I turn this way, this is the front of your brain here. So that would be here. And then over here is the back of your brain. That's down here, and kind of inside your brain would be right in there. So what we're looking at with emotion regulation is a two-way process where those parts deep down inside your brain, which are like the most animal instinct parts, they're reacting to what's going on. Because if there's a danger coming at you, you've got to kind of jump, right? You've got to have a reaction, right? Anything that's really instinctual is going to come from that bottom part of your brain, and it's going to say, hey, you better pay attention to what's happening. So that's one direction. Another thing that can happen in your brain is the other direction, going from the front back down. And the front is where you have thoughts and ideas, and maybe you make plans, and maybe you know that you're on a diet. And so that thing that looks really good right there on the table, you're going to say, oh, actually, you temptation, stop it. I'm not going to look. I'm not going to eat it. So you're kind of, your front part of the brain is the one that's going to weigh up all these different things and factor them all together and then make a decision. And that's, of course, that's hard. I mean, that's sophisticated. That's not something you would expect to see from an average, well, certainly not from a 2-year-old some 3-year-olds maybe start to do it. It's really something that's going to be developing through those early years, so that by the time children are into primary school, they are able to kind of stop and think about things. They're not as, reactive, right? They're not as impulsive. And so when we think about emotion regulation, we're saying what's happening in the brain is really natural, normal, adaptive, and actually usually very useful emotions from deep inside are being brought to the surface. And then the regulation piece of that is acknowledging them and thinking about how to express them, what to do with them. And, is now the right time? Is this the right way? All of that kind of stuff. So that's the back and forth. That's the bottom up and the top down. Okay. What I might do, actually, let me just go back to that for a second, because I wonder if it would be a good idea to pause there, and just, if anyone has a question in the chat, just to say, feel free to put them in the chat. There are so many of you that we can't guarantee I'll be able to answer them all in real time. But from time to time through the session, I can pause and say, let's have a question. Is there a question that went, for clarification or other? So is there a name for these parts of the brain? Okay, so the deep down part inside your brain, that's a lot of the emotional reaction stuff, would be, there's a number of parts of the brain that are involved in that. You have the amygdala, which is a strange sounding, I think it's probably from Latin word. You have then the front, that part up here that I said is more about thoughts and plans and considerations. That would be the frontal cortex. And again, cortex is also from Latin. The cortex is all of the surface of the brain. It's from the word shell, I think. But like when you're looking at that picture of the brain there, that whole thing is the cortex. So the frontal cortex, or sometimes we call it the prefrontal cortex, the further frontest most part of it, is the very thoughtful part of the brain. Can I give you one more fun fact about that before I go on to the next question? When you're looking at the brain, you can more or less say, moving from back to front or from kind of inside to outside, that's more or less the evolutionary path as well. So from an evolutionary perspective, animals, we share that with them. They have these instincts, they have the ability to, react to things that are going on around them, to move around. They can see also. So your sight, your vision is at the back of your brain. So all those like basic functions are kind of on the inside and at the back. And then as you go further forward, that's the much more higher order sophisticated things like thinking and reasoning, which not only do other animals not have, that's the most human part, it's the latest developing in evolution, also the latest developing in an individual human. So that's another way to remember it. But anyway, someone was asking about what's happening when the child cries throughout the day. There could be any number of things happening, but certainly it sounds like they're finding it difficult to regulate and to settle and to soothe. So I probably haven't told you something you don't know there. I don't know exactly what kind of answer you're looking for there. If you want to elaborate, feel free, or we could move on and maybe it's something you can pick up in the breakout discussions when we have the chance to share our experiences. Okay, so let's move on then. What do you notice about, some of you may be familiar with this if you've seen brain development slides before then. This is the kind of thing we often talk about, the idea of how brain cells develop over time. You can see a slice if you were able to look inside the brain, it might look like this at birth. So each one of these is a single cell at 6 years old, and then at 14 years old. What is the pattern? What do you notice? You can use the chat again if anyone wants to make an observation. Connection, then pruning. Somebody has all of the technical terms already. So exactly. So the idea that you have brain cells at birth, of course, they're already there. There's already things going on. And then they start to connect up, and we sometimes talk about wiring up. If you think of the analogy with a computer. And then as time goes on, there are actually fewer connections. And somebody's asking about the slides. Yes, we can share the slides. And I think there's going to be a recording as well. And so for those of us working with young children, that's yet another piece of evidence for you to confirm how important your work is, and that what's going on in these early years is that the brain is ready, and it's ready for anything pretty much, and it can adapt to all kinds of different things happening around. I mean, it's a good thing that it's built that way because the brain doesn't know what it's going to be born into or what experiences it's going to have, or indeed if there's going to be a global pandemic in its second year or whatever. So it's designed to be able to adapt. And then as time goes on, well, for those of us who are older, we'll say, unfortunately, we've become a little bit more set in our ways. And that starts actually very early. So the brain is already, I mean, the prime example of that is language, right? So the brain will learn the language it's exposed to. If it's exposed to multiple different languages in the early years, it'll learn multiple languages. But the idea is that it can adapt to what it's experiencing. And that's really important also because, yes, people are talking about trauma, exactly, all kinds of things. So that's important because it reinforces this idea that, yes, there is an element of natural development, but there are also things we can do as adults, and the environment around the child makes a difference. The interactions the child has make a huge difference to how everything's going to wire up. So coming back to emotion regulation, putting together everything we've said so far, the brain, it will do its thing to some extent. Yes, it will just do its thing. So letting children play and go out there and have experiences and follow their own interests and, follow through on their curiosity, etc. Those are all very important things, alongside the interactions and the, I would say, scaffolded interactions, those carefully chosen interactions that adults might have with children in those early years, because it helps them, fine tune those pathways, and it will, we say, kind of use it or lose it, so the more certain connections in the brain are used, the more they will be used, and the stronger they are, and the more reinforcements are built around those. And then the ones that aren't used as much will kind of eventually be weakened. So as far as emotion regulation, there are a lot of individual differences. Children have different experiences, they have different brains, they have different genetics, and so on. And all else being equal, the ability to regulate and have that top-down consideration of what's happening to oneself in oneself will develop. It will improve over time naturally, because that's what the brain will do. But it will also be affected by what's going on around it. And now, I actually, what I just said sounds awful. Like as if these aren't real children. Children will be affected by the interactions they have with the people around them, other children, their families, and if they're in a setting, of course, the staff in the setting. So adults, for example, if adults talk about feelings in the body, what does it feel like when I'm upset, or what does it feel like when I'm really happy? If adults stay calm and model emotion regulation for children, and if they provide opportunities to practice not in the moment when the children need it, because we all know if you're upset, that's not the moment. You're not taking anything in the moment. What you need are strategies that you've practiced before, so that in the moment you can just be reminded, oh, okay, with a little bit of support, oh, right. So I'm going to do some belly breathing now, or I'm going to count to 5 or down from 10, or, you know, whatever the strategy might be. So let's talk about some of these strategies, because that's what I said we were going to do in the session. And this slide was just to really reinforce that idea that there's a natural development, and then there's also what's going on around children and the experiences they have that can make a difference. There's a question in the chat about, is the brain fully developed by the age of 7? The brain is never finished changing. Development isn't something that, you know, stops or is complete at a certain age. As I said earlier, you know, our brains are still adapting to what goes on every single day, even as grown-ups, and they continue to do so into older age. And if you have been around older people, you know that there's interesting things that start to happen with their brains, and you can notice, oh, that's interesting, they're suddenly, you know, more emotional than they used to be, or they never used to make typos in a text message, and now they do it all the time. What's that about? Like, you can notice changes in people all throughout their life. And even ones, I mean, I'm not talking about like, oh, I decided to go on a course and learn how to drive a car. So where are we? So as far as what might be useful now, yes, I was thinking, how about a breakout discussion for a few minutes where you can share just where you are now with thinking about emotion regulation in your setting, in your own practice. Maybe it helps to think about a certain child or children that you're either working with now or you've worked with before. Maybe there's a child who it was remarkable, like you really noticed that they learned to share toys, or I just put some examples here to prompt you, you know, you can choose your own. Somebody who shouted or screams instead of using their words, who finds it hard to settle when frustrated. Somebody earlier asked about that. What about a child who's crying a lot, you know, a lot more? I notice it a lot more than other children. What's going on there? And I'll put these questions, this is assuming we managed to set up these breakout groups. Fingers crossed. It's happened before in a large Zoom. We're hoping it works today. So if it works, you'll be put automatically into your breakout rooms. And what we'll do then is we should, I think, be able to put these questions to broadcast them to everyone so that you've got them in your breakout rooms. But just in case, even now, maybe you could make a note of them or think, you know, think about them already so that you have a basis to get your conversation started. And the idea is to think about, this isn't an all or nothing thing, right? There will be times when somebody, a certain child shows more or less emotion regulation. And I'm just inviting you to think about those patterns, whether it's through the day, through the week, through the year. Do you notice any patterns? And then also what you normally do in your setting. What are the, you know, what's your go-to? So we'll start with that, and then we'll come back and we can look at the early years library and some of those techniques that that we've identified as being really effective. Are we? Wow. Oh. And then we'll take a minute to look and see what people are saying. Yeah. So for those of you who can scroll through the chat, you'll see what I see, which is, I think, some kind of frequent answers here coming up, like transitions, meal times, when they're hungry, when, of course, when we've said they can't do something that they want to do, and so on. I would just like to point out that those are all true of me too, and probably of you as adults. It's hard when you're hungry. I mean, we use the word hangry in my house a lot, and it's not always about my children. So there is an element to that. And when you think of that top down and bottom up that we talked about, the ability to stop and think about what you're doing before you respond, to say, it's okay to feel how I feel, but before I do something about it, I'm just going to think about this. That's much harder when you're tired, when you're in a new situation, when there's a lot to process, when that front part of your brain, which is the part that's going to be doing all that hard work, when it's tired already, or when it's busy, thinking about other things. Like where am I going to sit? Where do I put my body? Those elements of transition, which are like, there's a lot for me to get my head around right now. And you're also asking me to be really chilled about it. It's a lot, right? And as I say, the same for adults when you're in a new place, there's a lot going on. So just, I think a lot of understanding emotion regulation in the first place is having the empathy and thinking about what it means for us too, and that we're not that different than little ones. Okay, and then the second question to reflect on, shall we do the second one? What do you normally do? And we'll try it again like a waterfall, which was lovely this time. It worked very well. So again, you're going to type your answer in, hold it for a minute, and then when I say go, that gives everyone a chance to think and chat with their colleague if they want to first. So what do you normally do to support children in these moments? And maybe something, something short, practical. What's a strategy you might use? Okay, and don't press send. Don't press. Okay, press send. Everyone's doing it. Press send. Lovely. Gosh. So what we must do is download this chat. Shall we do that? And then we'll try and think of a way if we can put it all together, because there's so many nice ideas here. Somebody's just put square breathing, which I don't know if that is what I was taught in my prenatal NCT class or not. But I'll tell you what, in the moment, it was very hard to think about doing that when it came to it. Okay, still coming. So I'm seeing breathing, distraction, preparation, use of visuals. I saw something about flashcards earlier. So there's at least 4 different techniques in that, even just in that short summary I've given without being able to go through everything. I guess another one, the 5th one you might add in there that I saw quite a few, just scanning quickly, was being patient, taking the time and allowing the children time too. And that might be in a moment, but it also might be over a few days, right? Just giving the time, giving the warmth, the understanding, and showing them, that it's okay. So wonderful. I would like to move on now to the early years library. And thank you. If you still have others you want to share, please just do keep popping them in there. What we can talk about now. Can everyone see that? Back to it. Yeah. Wonderful. So what we can do now is thinking about all of the techniques that you all mentioned. You all have a wealth of experience here. You're professionals. What we did is we went to those programs. There are people who have these packaged programs for all kinds of things in early years. And we went to those programs and we said, okay, so for those programs that have been tested and tried out, and their impact has been measured, so we know whether or not they work. For all those programs, what do they have in common? What are the most common techniques that are being used to support children's development? And not only the most common techniques that are being used, but the ones that have been shown to be supported by evidence. And based on that, we were able to pull together the early years library, which is what I mentioned right at the start, a set of resources developed between my research group at Cambridge, the Early Intervention Foundation, and funded by the Nuffield Foundation. These are downloadable, they're PDFs. You can click on the QR code right now and have access to them directly. They're free. They're evidence-informed, as I said, and they're flexible because unlike those programs which you might have heard about that teach all these kinds of different techniques in a manual, those programs tend to be very expensive and you have to put a lot of staff hours into the training. So unlike those programs, these are free resources that you can just go and pick one and use it. For example, today our focus is emotion regulation. So that's here, regulating emotions, but we have put together a set of guides for all of the different areas that we found in all of the different evidence-based programs. And for any one of those, if you were thinking, oh, how could we do a little bit more math in our setting, for example, then you could go on this Early Years Library website and pull down one of those guides, open it up and have a look and find some ideas. So now, because we're focused on emotion regulation, we will just talk about that now, but I wanted you to know that it's one of many guides. And in the emotion regulation guide, you would have, so regulating emotions, you would have two techniques, two strategies, I guess you could say. And the reason that these two are there is because they are the two that we found commonly in all of those evidence-based programs. So that's not to say that all the other ideas that you shared a few minutes ago don't work. I'm not saying that they don't work. I'm saying that what we have here are two that we know for sure should work. Okay, so I want to talk you through those two. There's only two for emotion regulation, and they actually mirror really nicely that idea of top down and bottom up that I talked about. And that's not something we planned. We literally just looked at all of those programs, pulled out what was there, and we're presenting it as is. This is what we found. But it's remarkable, I think, that it turns out that the two techniques, the two strategies we found to be evidence-based in those programs also mirror that top-down and bottom-up process. So the first one is calming down, and that's, from the bottom up, the reactivity that you can experience, those natural emotions that come up. There are a number of things that adults can do to support children to calm down. And here are a few inspiring ideas. This is a screenshot from our early years guides. So I'm not going to read it out to you. You can download them and go back to them anytime you'd like. But in the guides, you would have a description of what we mean, for example, in the case of emotion regulation, what we mean by it, and then what the techniques are that we found, what is meant by calming down, for example, and then some inspiring ideas that were developed with a panel of practitioners. So hopefully you feel that these, sound like feasible things. They might not all work for all the children in your setting. Of course, some are more appropriate for 2-year-olds, some are more appropriate for the 4-year-olds. But it's interesting to see. Some of you talked about things like breathing, right? And that is in here. I presented this one time to a group talking about the breathing technique, and I think he was a deputy head. Anyway, somebody who was there, he said, something that we practice in our circle time. Again, this is about practicing, not when they're upset, practicing it so that it's a technique they have available. And you can remind them if they get really upset to try and use it. They practice hot chocolate. So smell it, breathe in, and then cool it down, blow out. I'm sure there would be a much more elegant way of demonstrating that. I've gone very quickly for the purposes of time, but just to say, of course, there's lots of different ways people can use these, but fundamentally, there's a core idea there. And then you can adapt them, and then they can become a habit within your setting. And then over time, children and adults know to say, oh, it's a moment like that, let's try this. I have to say also that we don't expect all of these to work for every child. Some children will respond really well to belly breathing, or to the hot chocolate thing, or to some other kind of pretending to be an animal and tuning into your body. Other children won't respond so well to that. They might respond better to counting, right? So it's not that any of these are a formula when we say it's evidence-based. Of course, you're still going to need to use your judgment and your knowledge of the children you're working with. But it's about having a range of options that you can draw on and that you're comfortable with, and your colleagues are also knowledgeable about, and you have a shared language to talk about them. Okay, so that was the set of calming down techniques. And the other one, you might have already guessed because I said it matches up nicely with the top down and the bottom up. So there's calming down, and then there's a very long-winded title, generating, choosing, and implementing solutions to cope with strong emotions. This one is that, okay, now I'm calm, what do I do? And again, a range of different ideas from those evidence-based programs, talking about emotions, talking about what you might do, having little strategies like stop, think, and choose. And again, practicing those things, maybe first with puppets, or talking about them when you're reading a book. Almost every, not every, but almost every children's book has something about, a child's or somebody, an animal's experience or perspective. How does that make them feel? All that additional conversation that can go on around it can be led in a way that's thinking about what can we do when we have strong feelings? What are some choices that we can make? What are different paths that we could go down? How do we make those choices? I'm going to pause again and look at the chat because I haven't had it open, just in case there are any further questions. I think those were mostly still in response to the question of what you already do. We have just a few minutes before 5, and I said we would pause at 5 o'clock and then allow a little bit of time for discussion. So I am going to pause there and maybe just summarize what we've said. We've said emotion regulation develops naturally over time. It's a universal capacity that our brains and bodies have, but that it's also very connected to what's happening in the interactions with others, with other children, with other grown-ups. And given that, for those working in early years, what techniques can we be aware of and can we practice to support children's emotion regulation? And then I gave you 2 kind of categories of things. One is about calming down, and the other one is about, once I'm calm, what am I going to do? That's my 1-minute summary. I think I do have some questions for another breakout, which we probably won't have time to go into. I can show you the questions, but the one that I really do think we should just take a moment now to think about is the last one. How do colleagues support each other when emotions are running high? Because it's not the case that we're robots, right? When there are children around us who are either extremely excited or extremely upset, or any form of emotion will, take some of your energy as well, to respond to. And okay, somebody's already said in the chat, so you swap in, and that's, yeah, just take a step back, take a break. There's all kinds of things that you could do. Does anybody else want to share in the chat what they do when, I'm thinking now about the adults, the grown-ups emotion regulation and their well-being in the case where there may be kids who are, I put the example of being very excited because emotions aren't just always about being sad or frustrated. Sometimes kids can be extremely excited, and that can also be a challenge to deal with. Cup of tea, yes, of course, cup of tea. Impossible for childminders. Yeah, we have to think about the impact on childminders who are the only adult often with the children, and what can they do to look after themselves when there's a lot of emotions going on. Colleague plays with my hair, lovely. I love that one. Yeah, breathe in and breathe out. So a lot of these things are very similar, as I've said, all the way along, for us as they are for children. Acknowledge the feelings. Take a moment to step back. Do some breathing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Super. So this is my last slide, and I've put the QR code here, that square you can see. If you want to scan that with your phone, you're welcome to visit our webpage at our research center. You can use our email address, which is pedal@edu.can.ac.uk. You can tweet at Sara BCAM, that's me. Get in touch in any way that you would like to, now or in the future. We are, as I say, always looking for people who are interested in getting into some of the evidence base with us and working together with us to co-design resources